Lesson 11, and we will begin in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 in just a few minutes. Before we get started, I'm going to ask Brother Robbie if he would to lead us in a word of prayer to start.
Let's pray. Gracious Father in heaven, we're so blessed to get this place tonight. Thank you for getting us here safely. We just pray that we have a good lesson. Michael leading us, and we just pray that we learn more about the First Corinthians and First and Second Corinthians, and we just pray that we know that our country is just in chaos right now. We know that just like the Corinthians, they weren't paying attention to your word, and they were doing things they shouldn't have been doing. We know our country is going astray in a lot of ways. Morality is not there. We just pray that something happens, and our leaders and good Christian folk will just be the example that our young people need to bring this country back. We just pray that with loved ones in Texas, and that those families will be comforted. Just give you the glory. Thank you for your son. This prayer. In Jesus' name.
Amen. Thank you. I do think when you it's still a little hot, John. I think when you take the responsibility to teach a class for a quarter, you should probably show up occasionally. So I apologize sincerely for not being here. I hope that it hasn't affected or hasn't been disjointed because of my absence. So thank you for hanging in there. Thanks to John for filling in for me on Sunday. We're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, and to be honest, I think when I decided that we were going to study 1 and 2 Corinthians this quarter, I forgot that 1 Corinthians 11 was in there. Might have made a different decision. This is a challenging section, I think, first part of this chapter. And we, a lot of different opinions from a lot of different quarters about some of what this chapter means. We're very blessed that we just went through a class and a half or two classes on deference to others and respect for differing opinions, and the fact that different people may need to respond differently to commands, frankly, or to different situations in life. Two people, because of their background, because of their personal history, they may respond differently in certain circumstances. Like that's what meat sacrificed to idols is what the whole chapter was about, right? So we're probably blessed that we have that background as we come into this study, where people come with different backgrounds and different cultures and different thoughts about it. Again, we're probably blessed that we've got that churning in the back of our minds, or I hope we do, and that we can have the same love and deference and respect for each other's backgrounds as Paul wanted the Corinthians to have. So 1 Corinthians chapter 11, I think because we're not dealing with very many verses in this example, that we should probably just go ahead and read them. And so I'm going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, starting in verse 2. And again, some of this will read a little bit differently depending on your version. But I'm going to read verse 2 through verse 16, if you don't mind to read along with me, okay? 1 Corinthians chapter 11, starting in verse 2. By the way, this is the New English translation. It's what I'm tackling tonight. I praise you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions just as I pass them on to you. But I want you to know this, that Christ is the head of every man, and the man is the head of a woman, and God is the head of Christ. Any man who prays or prophesies with his head covered disgraces his head. But any woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered disgraces her head. For it is one and the same thing as having a shaved head. If a woman will not cover her head, she should cut off her hair. But if it is disgraceful for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, then she should cover her head. For a man should not have his head covered, since he is the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of man. For man did not come from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for the sake of woman, but woman for man. For this reason, a woman should have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. In any case, In the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For just as woman came from man, so man comes through woman, but all things come from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not nature itself teach you that if man has long hair, it is disgraceful for him? But if a woman has long hair, it is her glory, for her hair is given her as a covering. If anyone intends to quarrel about this, we have no other practice, nor do the churches of God. So, with that, again, that text, widely debated, a lot of different thoughts and opinions about what that text mean and what it should mean to us. I thought we might start with the way that we begin here in our lesson, if you did lesson 11, and that is a study of the Greek word for head. And because that word is used several times throughout this text, and trying to understand what that word means, I think, is important. So, did anyone have an opportunity to look up that word? What did you find about that word that is unique or interesting? Somebody tell me what we found.
I don't remember when I did it, but I got authority and submission based on love, function, leadership, and chain of command.
Okay. There's some authority and leadership thoughts in there. Anything else?
So is that how the head is used in these verses?
That
In
is-
that context, or does it change?
So that's a good question, Miss Carol. One thing that I will answer your question by not answering it whatsoever. I think that you'll find if you look up this Greek word, and this, by the way, this is the word that's used in verse 3, and verse 4, and verse 5, and verse 7, and verse 10. It's the same word. And much as in English, again, if I'm handling this correctly, I'm no scholar, check me on this. Just as in English, this word has a dual meaning. It can mean your physical head on your shoulders, or it can mean authority or figuratively for someone who is chief or prominent or an authority. So it has, again, as in English, it has that dual meaning, I believe. And because it does have that dual meaning, it creates some ambiguity in some of these verses about what is the correct use. For example, if you go to, let's see, if you go to verse 7, I'm sorry, I was looking on my machine here. Let me turn to the passage in Scripture. If you go to verse 7, I think it's pretty clear in verse 7 that we're talking about your physical being, right? Your physical head. For a man ought not to cover his head. I think, at least my reading, we're talking about a physical head in that verse. Whereas in verse 3, we're clearly not talking about a physical head on your shoulders. We're talking about rule authority. We're talking about submission. We're talking about that kind of head or headship, right? Verse 3, I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ. Well, clearly we're not talking about physical head. We're talking about structure and roles of authority. So that word is used both ways. And where it gets difficult, at least in my judgment, is you get down to, like, for example, verse 4. In the end of verse 4, are we talking about physical head or are we talking about authority? Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered, I think we're talking physical head, dishonors his head. Well, does that mean that he dishonors his physical head in some way, or that he dishonors his figurative head, which we just said in verse 3 was who? Christ. Again, because that word can be used in both ways, I think perhaps creates some of the ambiguity here, or perhaps that's the case. So in verses, and verse 5 reads very similarly, about a wife prays or prophesies uncovered, disgraces her head. And so I guess start from there, based on our study of that word. In those verses, do we think that they're disgracing their physical heads, or we do think that they're disgracing the ones that are in authority? Miss Carroll's going to vote for the ones that are in authority. Tara votes for both. Okay? Explain your answer.
Well, from what I studied, the temple prostitutes were designated, the pagan idols were designated by uncovered or shaved heads, uncovered, no cloth and or no hair.
Yes.
And so if that were the cultural context of this verse, she would be dishonoring her husband, her elders, or her fellow Christians, and her own self by appearing as a temple prostitute
Okay?
in the body of Christ.
So Tara notes that we are in a specific culture here as we go through this chapter. There's no question about it. We're in a specific culture, and one of the things that you can find about this culture is that the prostitutes at the temple, they would be commonly recognized, would be commonly known as having shaved heads, I believe. I think most of your historical, would back that up. Your historical scholars would back that up. So that helps us, I believe, to understand a little bit about having the head shaved in verse 6. Wouldn't that be a disgrace, Paul says, if a woman had her head shaved? Perhaps that helps us to explain a little bit of that. And so, with that in mind, how, and I think Tara made this point, a woman who is coming to worship in that regard, how could she be dishonoring or disgracing her head, as in her husband, as we read in verse 3? Yes. 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 Yes.
Which many people have concluded means a physical covering, when in fact it just means hair. Or it's not referring to a physical covering. But I think the ultimate point here is that it's cultural. It was a temporary command, designed, of course, to try to keep the church pure, and of course, at the same time, to teach this concept of headship. It starts with Jesus. Go to this Ephesians chapter 5, Jesus, man, and wife. Does that make sense?
Yes. And so kind of leads to this question, and as I got down to my takeaways here, and I tried to digest this, and we're certainly going to circle back to all those points, John. As I tried to digest this, I wrote down this question for myself, which I would ask the room, and that is, Corinth had real problems, right? Like Corinth had very significant, deep spiritual issues. They had issues about division. They had issues about immorality. They had issues about their worship being a free-for-all. They had real serious issues. And so in the midst of all of those really, serious, deep, significant issues, Paul devotes half a chapter here to fashion. Why does that, again, I know that is a very cold reading of that. I did use those words intentionally. Why do you think Paul finds it useful to spend 12 verses here talking about an issue of fashion to a church who's got serious doctrinal issues? Somebody help me make sense of that.
Got to start somewhere.
Okay.
Well, even today, head covering or no, I could
Yes.
And so in that regard, fashion, or however you want to phrase it, what we wear, cultural trends are connected to spirituality. If I'm dressing or acting in a way that shows I'm not in subjection to Christ or the elders or you, that's a spiritual problem, not a matter of fashion.
Yes. Hope everybody was able to hear that answer. Like, I'm going to summarize it, put my own spin on it, Tara, and you raise your hand and tell me I'm wrong if I did this correctly. But I think the reason this matters is because this is not a fashion question, right? That I don't think Paul would dedicate half a chapter of he wouldn't have called it a chapter. He'd dedicate a few paragraphs of his letter to fashion. That the issue, and I don't know if this is a response to a question. You know, that was one of the notes in your lesson. Was this a response to a question? I'm not sure based on the way he leads into the conversation if it was or not. Perhaps it was. But if the Corinthians ask a question, hey, what do you think about about the length of hair, or whatever question they would have asked, Paul took that opportunity in verse 3 to teach a little bit of a different lesson, right? I think that verse 3 is key to the whole passage. That what we're really talking about is authority and submission in verse 3. And I think you'll see that theme throughout the next 4 chapters. If we were to go through, if we were to be going through this book verse by verse, chapter by chapter, we would see that this concept really starts here and it carries all the way to the end of chapter 14. Remember, we already talked about the also difficult verses in the end of chapter 14 about women's quietness in the church. That lesson, in my judgment, and it will, and even in verses between here and there, of submission and roles carries through that whole section. So I just throw that out there to say that this is not a question of fashion, and although we're dealing with what is no question a cultural element there in Corinth, the lesson here can't be just about fashion for us, right? There's something more. There's got to be a little something more on the bone here, I think, and I think in my judgment it has to do with authority and submission under Christ, and then the role of the husband and wife. So I'll leave that to your thoughts.
Michael, there's a little bit of thought in there. We just finished the Big Style.
Yes.
And, you gotta, even though it's okay, don't do it if it's gonna offend somebody. And some of the things I was looking at, reading about, talk about some of these new Christian women, perhaps I've got the right to do whatever I want now. I'm equal with me. I'm equal. We're all equal. So if I want to stand up and do whatever I want to do, then that's okay. And I think Paul is kind of addressing that. We still got this role that each one of us God gives us in Genesis.
Yes.
And we can't disregard that just because we're all Christians together.
Yeah.
You still got a role to play, and we still got to be in submission.
Yes. So I think that speaks to the larger role of submission there. Yes, ma'am.
Let's go back to fashion.
Yes, ma'am.
These ladies, these could have been prostitutes in the past.
Sure.
They had their heads shaved. So maybe he is saying while your hair is growing out, you need to cover to show submission. Are we thinking, okay, the two is a shaved head or hair? Do we look at it that way, or are we looking at it as a head covering?
I know I've heard John's thought on that this is all hair and all. I think there's evidence for that in verse 15, but there's some other thoughts in there that at least give me some pause on that. The end of verse 6 gives me some pause about that, I think. Is that the right verse? Since it is disgraceful for a woman to cut off her hair or shave her head, let her cover her head.
Yes.
Does that make sense if that is only talking about hair? John, you got a response to that one?
I think the emphasis is not on a covering. I think he references that as being something that under some circumstance that may, of course, diminish that association. But I think the emphasis of this chapter is not on, of course, like many of the churches, like some of the churches do, authorize or at least command the use of a covering. Because most of the coverings that are used today aren't remotely what he's commanding them to do as far as a veil or that kind of covering.
Right.
But I just want to emphasize one other thing, and that is that I think you're right. It's almost a play on words because he's talking about head coverings, but he's also talking about headship.
Yes.
And I can only imagine that maybe one of the questions that came to Paul was, my wife's doing this, it's bringing shame to my family, it's bringing shame to me as a man. I think that there may have been a dishonoring or a dishonoring of the woman's husband in these cases.
Yes.
At least it's inferred to me that not only were they bringing shame upon the church, which clearly is a point that we're going to continue, bringing shame upon their husband
Yes.
as well. And they weren't acknowledging that headship that exists. That's my
No, again, starting from here and going all the way through chapter 14, and I think there's some scholars who make the assumption, let me back up. That sentence wasn't making sense. Does all of chapter 11 through 14 make more sense if we start with the assumption that there were women in the church at Corinth who were either faking the use of spiritual gifts or in some way trying to take a larger public role in the worship? And does everything that is written in those 4 chapters make more sense in that light? I think there is some credence to that. Again, I'm not saying that's for certain what it is, but thinking about it in that light, reading those chapters gave me some insight to that. And I think it's a little bit, John, what you talked about is it seems evident that there was women in the church who were either because the men were unwilling or unable or flat out weren't doing it, they were taking some of a role in the leadership in the public worship. At least it's what it appears to me. And I think that everything that Paul says in this context, again through the next few chapters, kind of have that in mind. And so whatever covering that we're talking about, what was the point of it? That was the point, right? It was a reminder of submission. Again, there's a lot of debate about this verse, but I'm going to go to it anyway. I may wish I hadn't. If we go to verse 10, that's why a wife should have a symbol of authority on her head. Miss Carol, I'm going to forget for a moment that it says because of the angels. But that's why a wife should have a symbol of authority on her head. Like this is the purpose, that it is a reminder of the roles that God has given. And again, the way that Paul writes beautifully about marriage in Acts 5 and other places about Christ and the church, I don't think that's a demeaning statement. I don't think it's intended to be, or a misogynist statement in any way, but that it is a reminder of a role in the church. That, and whether you want to think about it as it uses the word symbol in the New English, I'm not sure that's exactly the right word, but it is a reminder of that. Whatever you take that covering to be, it is a reminder of that. And these Corinthian women, in whatever way, needed a reminder of what Paul teaches in verse 3. They needed a reminder of that, and this was in some way intended to do that. At least that is my view of it. Happy to be wrong about that. Other thoughts, comments?
There's no evidence whatsoever in the first 500 years of church history that there was no musical instrument used. There's no evidence in church history whatsoever that women had any type of public role in church. So if that did pop its head up here, there's no evidence that it existed. I mean, for a long period of time.
So agreed. So what do we make of verse 5 in that context? Because I struggle with that. I mean, I hear what you're saying, and I agree with you. And yet we read in verse 5, every woman who prays or prophesies with head uncovered dishonors her head. Is that a public worship comment, or is that a life at home in bed comment?
Well, we know that some women received that gift.
Yes.
And so I think that whether they were usurping men here, they could have been, I don't know. But I think that the point here is that they were connecting themselves one way or the other to the paganism and the fornication that was existing right at the hill.
Yes.
I mean, it would be the equivalent of, I don't know, I can use lots of examples today. It would be like someone doing, say, teaching Bible class in the back with a, with a particular type of tattoo on their face, That, I think that that's the emphasis of it, but could there have been a usurping of authority? Sure.
Yeah. Is there a way to act in public worship that today would be disgraceful to the woman's head? For sure. I think we could all conjure up examples of that. I think that was going on at Corinth. Would it be surprising that was going on at Corinth, what we've already studied about their worship, right? I mean, what we studied about the Lord's Supper it was a fiasco. They were coming and going, and we know from chapter 14 that multiple people were speaking at a time, likely based on this passage, in my judgment, male and female. It had turned into an ungodly scene. And so, again, if you're Paul and you're trying to encourage the ones that are new and trying to do this correctly, but trying to discourage the falseness of that, like that is a very difficult line to walk. And this is the line that again, I think he's trying to walk here in this passage. How do you teach submission in that context without demoralizing these new Christians who are just learning about these things? I think it's difficult.
What's interesting here, he does not condemn this woman for cross.
Agreed.
Any of those activities.
Agreed.
He seems to be, again, I agree that this isn't a cosmetic fashion argument.
Yes.
I think there's something very deep to this that maybe, for multiple reasons, connected to, like, these Corinthians were acting like and looking like in every respect the pagans right outside.
Yes. And so, are symbols of submission a good thing? If for ladies that helps to get in that frame of mind and have, I think that's a beautiful thing, frankly, as long as it's done in the appropriate way. So, again, I think the context of 1 Corinthians chapter 8 and the meat sacrificed to idols, that because we come from different backgrounds and different beliefs and that we all have to kind of respect other opinions as long as we're building those fences for ourselves and not others, so to speak. Other thoughts or comments? All right, let's tackle, hey, as long as we're in uncomfortable stuff, let's tackle another one. Can I pray with a hat on? Carol says no. So I say that in only tongue slightly in cheek in light of verse 4, every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. What do we make of that, and how strictly are we to interpret that? Literally.
I don't think verse 5 is actually specifically reference to a hat or covering this. I don't think it's here either, but again, I think that word, that Greek word, is more of a general term and not a specific term.
And so what are we to make of that verse? If we're not to make that of it, what are we to make of it, in your judgment?
Yeah, I think it has to be referencing to humility or submission in that sense. I mean,
And are we going to compare that in any way to verse 14? Are we combining those thoughts?
so this is in reference to hair.
Yes. So is the earlier verse talking about a covering in terms of hair? That praying or prophesying with long hair is a disgrace?
I think you find some commentators who say yes. I'm certainly not dogmatic about it.
Yeah,
Kaufman believes that this was from hair, not cover.
right.
Not that he's the authority, but clearly
Yeah.
he cites a lot of good sources to suggest that. So that's where I would lean. But I don't know for sure.
So, can I pray with a hat on? Here, I will say this, but I'm going to let you, sorry, Miss Carol, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Are you saying you can wear a hat as long as you're showing humility?
I am saying, could this be a 1 Corinthians 8 issue? We know that a hat is nothing, but not all have this knowledge. If a hat makes my brother stumble, I will never wear a hat again. Maybe sincerely. I know that when me and Sam Price were coaching Little League last night and we asked all the kids to pray, we told them to all take their hats off. There was probably so is that just a cultural thing? Is that a respect thing? Is that a submission thing? I think maybe all the above are true there. Any thoughts or comments? Yes, sir. I just like how you didn't even look my way, Ryan. I think I appreciate that. I believe the head is the same. I'll let John do some study there. He's good at doing this on the fly. I believe head is the same. I think covering is the one that we will have some ambiguity or some debate about. But the head, whether it means authority or physical head, I believe is the same word. John can back me up on that.
I think you're right. I think the word veil or covering, that's the word that
Creates some debate. Yeah. But I believe the word head is the same word. I think it's that kafale, or I might not be saying that right, but it's in that neighborhood. Okay? You're thoroughly confused. Well, that's not encouraging to me, Carol. It makes me feel like I haven't done great here. So tell me, where can we create some clarity for you?
I guess I'm confused with what we should be doing according to God's law, or God's law, I guess, and what the Corinthians were doing. I don't know, Michael, I'm totally. Should we all come in here with long hair? Should we all wear a head covering? Should the men wear hats and take them off? I mean, but how do you decide? How do you decide what is cultural and what is today?
Yes. So I think you ask an excellent question, and that is what are we to take from this passage that is strictly cultural, and what is strictly binding? And I think that is difficult, and I think that everybody, to some extent, has to read this and make good judgments. I think that if the elders were to have a firm stance on that we would be in submission to them based on verse 3, right, and other passages, if they had a strong feeling about that. But otherwise, is it a 1 Corinthians 8 issue where we all have to read and make our own judgments and respect everybody's opinion and do our best to handle it correctly in our own lives? Perhaps, at least that may be where I fall. I asked the elders. I'm going to ask them directly. Where's Jeff? How'd Jeff get out of this? Thoughts, gentlemen?
Part for the custom in the old Eastern way
Yes.
of wearing the veil or the covering, and it's a matter of subordination. And if they thought it was insubordinate, disrespectful
Yes.
to the husband, or even the man praying,
Yes.
it wouldn't be an issue if it wasn't a tradition in that day. Is that a valid statement?
I think I agree with almost all of that. There in some way, and whether it's because of the affiliation with the temple or the prostitutes or whatever, but in whatever way, in this setting, that woman praying or being in the worship with her head uncovered was a symbol of her disrespect for her husband in some way. At least that's what I can gather from this. There was an element of insubordination, to use your word. There was an element of disrespect in that act, and that was the problem. The rest is the symptoms and how, what can we do to, but that seemed to me was the core problem. You're getting ready to say something profound.
I was not. But, as you said, I think and it goes back to, Romans 6. I mean, I think it's definitely a cultural thing we see here.
Yes.
But if folks read that and in their mind, they're
Convicted about it.
then they're wrong if they don't.
Absolutely.
And your point, ones that do it, we have some here. I'm like, I think it's a wonderful thing. They feel good about that. They're showing submission to the position they're in, and I think that's fine. And whether the elders have said and discussed this in detail, we have not. But I think we would all agree on that. That it's, we're not mandating that it has to be done because we don't see that completely. But
Yes.
if others see that and they feel convicted by it, then they should be.
And to take it a step further, perhaps even if it got to the point where you guys thought in your wisdom, say, hey guys, things are out of control here, and to help everyone understand these roles better, we think this is a good and important and necessary thing. Anyway. Were you getting ready to say something? I thought you had your hand raised. Yes, sir.
I was going to say that that coming from the elders exactly, I think, the right approach. And Kim and I attended a church while I was in medical school in San Francisco that was a recovered home church. Because one of the head men that started that congregation believed that was in fact not a cultural issue, but was a command.
Yes.
But they didn't judge us because Kim didn't wear a covering. And so they didn't make us do that or push that, even though they were convicted about it.
Yes.
But I think that's the right approach. I think that you can make a strong argument that this is cultural and that, today the idea of how we wear our hair means something is completely foreign.
Yes.
But in this context, it meant a lot.
Yes.
More than I think what we're even aware of. It was a huge cultural statement.
And it could have, sorry, not to interrupt you. It could have even been that it was somewhat provocative, right? To see a woman with her head shaved. It brought all, it had a certain connotation to it. Could someone dress provocatively in 2022 in such a way that it was an embarrassment to the church and to her head? And of course, right? We would understand that in that context, where it was disruptive to the service. Gentlemen, back in the days where you had to pass the Lord's Supper, could a female dressed provocatively distract from the worship? Of course. Like that's happened. So I think you put it in that context, maybe.
It's also, I think, a question of being set apart. If you come out of this pagan cult of Aphrodite and you're claiming that you've become Christian, but you're still holding on to this thing that we kind of understand had some relationship to this cult, this worship of Aphrodite, why are you hanging on to that?
Yes.
If someone today came out of some sort of criminal or hate group or whatever and became a Christian and claims that they put all that away, why would they still wear patches or insignias of that group if that's really not a part of their life? And it's maybe an extreme example, but it's kind of the same thing of not quite letting go of the former life.
Yes. Well said. Well said. Yes.
Another verse, kind of similar, 1 Peter 3:3 through 5 says, "Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the
Yes.
we've kind of missed the point, and for that reason, I think it goes back to kind of that police psychosis discussion. If I feel for some reason that I need to wear the covering, I should wear it, or else it's violating my conscience and it's sinful. If my conscience is okay and I feel like I don't need to wear it, then, that's okay, and we shouldn't be judging one another, but I could wear it and not have love and those new, that it talks about in Colossians 3, compassionate heart, kindness, humility. If I wore the head covering, I'd miss that.
Yes.
I've missed it.
Yes. Which kind of gets to the last question, and I think we're almost out of time. Gets to the last question in the lesson, and that is, do clothes and hair length matter in our worship to God? I think it would be foolish to say no, because we just spent an hour talking about how it mattered a lot to our brothers in Corinth. I'm not sure that it always matters the way we think it matters, but I know that it matters because it does, to your point, in some instances, tell on our hearts. And so, in that way, by the way that it's most common in the New Testament, how it tells on your hearts is prideful. I would note that. I think that's interesting. 1 Peter 3 and other places. But it also can be disrespectful and tell on our hearts. So I think it would be foolish to say that it doesn't matter, but also we'll be careful making fences for myself that I put others inside. That's Kyle's thing, and I stole it, but I like it. So, other thoughts? Have we had a first bell?
The Old Testament, when it says to uncover the head, that strip off your hair.
Okay.
Covering idea, the Old Testament directly correlated to hair.
Yep. Thanks, everybody, for their thoughts. We will begin what lesson is it, 12? Lesson 12 on Wednesday. Begin talking about spiritual gifts, and we're moving somewhat through the book. We're going to go from chapter 11 to chapter 12. And so the primary verses for our study will be out of 1 Corinthians chapter 12. And look forward to having that conversation with everyone on Sunday. Not Wednesday, Sunday. Sorry.